Hello, and that's right, this video is the massive review of this, the UNAS Pro from UniFi. This is the first video in a series of videos that are going to come out in the next week, 10 days, 2 weeks. It's going to be this massive review. There's going to be a shorter version of it with some pros and some cons. We're of course going to be comparing against Synology and QNAP here on the channel, and we're going to be doing some setup guides. So if this video seems a wee bit long for you, there are chapters along the bottom. Do keep in mind the next week or so there's going to be a whole bunch of videos on this device, because I genuinely can't figure out whether I love or hate this thing. But without further ado, let's crack on with the review. That is right, we got there in the end. This is the UniFi Network Attached Storage Device, the UNAS or UNAS Professional from Ubiquiti, which is their first network attached storage device entering the UniFi ecosystem. We heard leaks, we've heard bits and bobs. There has been demand on a system like this for such a long time.
I am inevitable.
I think it'll be fair to say that no other network attached storage solution from any of the brands that I've talked about ever has had the kind of build up this system has and the weight of expectation behind it. People have been utilizing network attached storage in the UniFi ecosystem for a number of years for backups, just to move away from cloud services, but also more than that. Brands like Synology, QNAP, Asus, TerraMaster, Unraid, TrueNAS, you name it. All of them have been in the field and introduced into existing UniFi ecosystem. This is the first. This is UniFi's own network attached storage device, which I am sure they hope will replace the server in your existing UniFi ecosystem. But what do we think? Does it live up to the expectation? And more importantly, does it deserve your data? Price-wise, I've got to give them some credit here. That $499 sticker there for a 2U 7-bay 10G ready rack mount, that is kind of bonkers. Synology and QNAP, whether you look at $499 or this scale of device, neither one of those brands have got any solution even comparable to this. At $499, you're looking at 4-bay desktop models without 10G on board, or rack mount wise and comparing hardware, the best they've got is $800 to $1,000 alternative. So $499 for this device, even with its comparatively modest hardware, is pretty darn good. And once you factor in that the demand for a UniFi NAS has been so long running, and that it's their first solution, many of us, myself included, would have assumed the price would have been a good deal higher than this. But $499 only resides about 100 nicker more than the UNVR, a similar hardware-equipped system, and this one being a 24/7 NAS storage solution, fair play. We got to talk about the hardware here. We got to address a few elephants in the room straight out the gate. And number one, yes, this seems to me largely identical to that of the 7-bay, I said 7-bay, we'll come back to that later, UNVR system. The UNAS here seems to be utilising that same production there in terms of the half-depth rack mount, 2U 7 SATA bays there on the front, two network ports there, 10 and 1G, and that lovely little LCD panel that we'll talk about later on there. I love a half-dev rack mount, but I know it's not for everyone. I will also say that those 7 bays there on the front, one, you don't have to use their own storage drives, even though they do provide a range of different drives that you can use in this system. You don't have to use theirs, you can go third party. I tested all the way up to 24 TB drives from Seagate. They worked absolutely fine. The system took them straight on board into the storage pool. I went as low as 1 TB, absolutely laughing there. I partially populated, worked like a charm. I introduced new drives, and the system had reactive storage. And by that I mean, if I introduced a new drive, it would absorb it into the existing storage pool just like that, which I really liked. On the other side of the scale, we have to highlight number one. I wasn't able to create more than one storage pool, and I created one storage area, which was lovely. I couldn't divide it up into multiple RAIDs. I couldn't create, for example, 2 drives in a RAID 1 and then RAID 5 the rest of them. I couldn't do that. I could go for single and dual disk redundancy, but I couldn't find any option, say, for RAID 0, which I know isn't going to be for everyone, and RAID 0 doesn't have any failover, but still RAID 0 would have allowed me to get some good performance out of these drives, and then perhaps I could have gone for a secondary system as my backup there instead of relying on RAID, which of course isn't a backup, it's a safety net. On top of that, I will highlight that there isn't any other storage means here. You can use 2.5-inch drives within the individual trays. If we get one of these open and show you. So inside there, it's got one of their own drives. This is a Toshiba MG drive, but inside there is screw holes for 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch media there. But there wasn't really any means to, you know, add things like M.2 SSDs, which have become largely standard these days. And I think that is going to be coming across as a very regular theme throughout the course of this review. When we talk about the general status quo of network attached storage in 2024 going into 2025, I'll say right now, this system is not trying to compete with Synology and QNAP. Time and time again, when I was looking at the software and the hardware architecture, it's very much trying to do its own thing, which unfortunately means that those that are going to compare it against the status quo in NAS, unfortunately I am one of those people, it is going to end up coming across lackluster, because even though they aren't competing seemingly against the existing players for the last 10 or 20 years in the storage market of NAS, other people are going to. But returning to the subject of design, the fact this is a half-depth rack mount chassis with those 7 bays inside, it makes a surprisingly low audio level when in operation. Right now I've booted the device, and again this system boots super quick, more on that in a moment. It doesn't make that much noise when in operation. Obviously heavy writes and more industrious hard drives inside are going to push up that ambient noise, but just generally if I go quiet just for a little bit and move the mic here closer to the system, you'll give you some idea about the noise level I'm talking about. That's a fan outside if that comes up on the mic. So yeah, pretty low noise. The system only has a single PSU inside, which I've got mixed feelings about, and power consumption when I had the system at the CPU between 40 and 50% utilization, and with all of the hard drives being accessed simultaneously, the system reported between 75 and 79 watts power consumption. Now when the system was in idle, I got that down as low as 31 there. Again, you've got to factor in the larger drives. It arrives with 160 watt internal PSU, and it's an open PSU, which is going to make replacement in like an RMA or anything like that a lot more difficult. And the fact that there isn't a redundant power supply means that if that PSU blows, the system's offline now. I'm quite surprised, as a rack mount system, there wasn't really any option for this device rocking out with a secondary PSU. There is UniFi's own kind of battery failover that you can get included into your rack mount array there, but I kind of like the idea of a redundant PSU personally. But again, this is about UniFi doing it their own way, which again we're going to keep hitting against throughout the course of this review. Now, returning to what I mentioned earlier on about quick boot, this system can be booted from cold, uninitialized to right into the desktop to within 3 to 5 minutes, including storage creation, although that doesn't include the synchronization because of RAID, but still nonetheless, the idea that you can buy this off the shelf and have it set up inside 5 minutes is insane. And also keep in mind, you do not need to have a UI account. You don't have to set this up online. It can be completely set up offline. You don't need to sign up to UniFi. You can have this system purely offline, which I know is going to be popular. On top of that, you can set the device up on the local area network, or you can go ahead and use a mobile phone with the UniFi app and use Bluetooth. Again, no need to have a UI account in order to do it. Just create a local account, and that extends, by the way, all the way down to using something like SSH. More on that on the software portion. But unfortunately, things are brought back down to earth when we start talking about connectivity on this device. Now, we're going to have to be a little balanced here. This system only has 7 bays of storage. Again, kind of a weird number. But that also means with 7 SATA drive bays there, particularly if you're going to use hard drives, the potential for maximum performance is actually significantly reduced there. So on the one hand, I'm going to try to be fair when I critique the ports and connections on this device. Nevertheless, only having these 2 ports, and one of them being an effective 1G failover network in, kind of like a Wi-Fi in or a ping port, and the other one being an SFP 10G, kind of bums me out a little bit there. Only having a single 10G port on this system makes sense in the context of all of that storage, but slightly less so when you're talking about a wider arrangement of storage systems that you may be utilizing for backups or introducing into the network. That 1000 megabytes per second or 1 gigabyte per second there is just a little bit miserly. And also, There isn't any 10G failover because there's only a single port there. There's no USB ports anywhere on this device. You can't factor in any kind of network upgrade via a USB. You can't upgrade with a PCIe upgrade slot. There's no PCIe. It is very much a you get what you get system there. But talking of get what you get, what performance do you expect from this device? I fully populated this device with 8 TB drives with a 1 disk failover, so you've effectively got 7 drives being written to there, and I performed from a Windows 10 Pro machine with a Gen 4 M2 NVMe over 10 GBE onto this system via a 10G switch, SFP point-to-point, no RJ45 adapters. Now, in AJA with a 1 gig repeated test file, I achieved 410 to 430 megabytes per second average write and 440 megabytes per second average read. I then moved over to AttoDisk benchmark, and in AttoDisk benchmark I achieved 484 megabytes per second write peak and 477 megabytes per second peak read. So the write was ever so slightly weirdly higher. Then I moved over to Crystal Disk, and in Crystal Disk I achieved 392 over 496, and finally I used just a simple Windows 10 transfer of around 100 gigabyte. It was thousands of files all mixed onto this system and back, and I achieved 472 I should say, over 427 megabytes per second peak. So again, for those drives, that performance is all right and by no means achieving full saturation, so there is the counter argument as mentioned for only having the single 10, but still nonetheless that does mean to a lack of failover there internally. Yes, for remote access you've still got that secondary port there, so again with a 100 meg cap on the secondary port, at least that's something. But had I used SATA SSDs, numbers would have been slightly higher. But there is another reason why performance on this may not have been as high as that. That is right, the hardware inside this device is definitely designed to be efficient. It is designed to effectively get as much done with as little as possible. And much like the UNVR, this system runs on a quad-core ARM processor. It's a Cortex A57 quad-core 1.7 GHz CPU, and you heard me right, an ARM-based CPU. Despite that rather modest hardware, I very rarely ever maxed out the CPU and memory on this. Now there's good and bad reasons for that, but I will say that an ARM-based CPU tends to not really give you great write numbers. It can give you pretty good read numbers, but in terms of write numbers, they generally are not fabulous, and I think that was why we saw repeatedly slightly lower write numbers than read in numerous tests on this device. Now, that CPU being power efficient is still able to do an incredible amount of work within the UniFi software that's running on this with Drive and just a general dashboard and utility over time there. And factoring in that single 10G and factoring in what they're trying to do here, trying to nail down fundamentals rather than try to do everything out the gate, that CPU and memory does make a decent amount of sense. However, we've got to talk more about the software and what this can and cannot do. And for that, we're going to have to hop on the laptop.
So it was always going to be difficult to try and show you the full extent of what the software is able to do and not do in this video without making this video hours long. So I formed it into a series of pros and cons. I'm going to start with the pros first, because I'll be straight with you, the majority of them are pros, and I think any limitations that I came across on the UNAS Professional or UNAS Pro largely came down to this system trying to nail down the fundamentals, but unfortunately kind of not stacking very well against the likes of Synology, DSM and QNAP QTS in terms of the features that those brands have accrued over the last 20 years. So let's crack on straight away with the dashboard. So straight out the gate, something that I think a lot of users that are hopping off of cloud service are going to appreciate, that is that the UNAS can be set up completely offline. You don't need to take advantage of a UI.com account. You don't need internet access. This system can be completely set up offline. Indeed, not only can you set it up over the local area network if you choose, but there's even the mobile application that allows you to set up the device over Bluetooth. Really nice stuff. That said, if you do want to go ahead and associate this with a UI.com account, I will say that the system does arrive with full system configuration backup and restore options straight out the gate. You don't have to pay anything extra for that, and although that's not the full data set, that does mean that if you're setting this up for the first time or you're re-establishing an old device and want to reuse a restore of all your configuration you've got before, it's really easy to do straight out of the day. Next up, setup itself. Good lord, it was quick. I'll be honest, I've dealt with a lot of rack mount setups in the past, but I'll say right now that this system genuinely set up from turning it on to getting into the dashboard in a little over 3 minutes. That didn't include RAID storage synchronization there in the background, but I will say from boot into finding the device to local account creation into storage and then done with the GUI was genuinely 3.5 minutes. Next up, I want to return to the subject of that dashboard. I've got to say that the UniFi dashboard is pretty darn clear if you're an existing UniFi ecosystem user. It definitely is a different change of pace to Synology DSM and QNAP QTS and TrueNAS and Unraid and the rest. But I will say if you're an existing UniFi user, everything is pretty much where you're going to expect it to be, from the storage management, file services, users, logs, notifications, analytical information, settings and more via that new control plane. I do think everything for a UniFi user is exactly where you expect it to be, and it kind of underlines exactly what Ubiquiti are trying to do with this system. It'd be very easy for them to perhaps try to ape some of the other brands there in the market and change their entire workflow. But I think they've gone ahead and gone, do you know what? We know how we want to do things. We think we know how our users want to have things. So they've aped what they've already got within their existing UniFi network solutions. Whether that's good, whether that's bad, that's really going to come up to you, the end user, to say. But for me, I've got to at least give them credit for maintaining that in-house style and just snappy and responsiveness all the way through. That said, for the network savvy, there's a lovely little option here if you want to go ahead and enable SSH configurations and access to the system. So for those who aren't aware, SSH is a terminal level access, kind of command line based exclusively. And although you can turn it on and off, is not exactly a new thing in NAS, I do like the fact that it does need and forces you to create a dedicated SSH password. Again, not unique to this system, but I like the fact that they're not making it easy to get super user command level control. Another presentation highlight, the way the RAID pool and storage is depicted. Again, this is not going to be a system for the highly technically noused. This is set up and forget storage, but nevertheless you are going to have to create your RAID pool in the best way for your needs, and the way that the drives, levels of protection, hot spares, and even storage volume creation, subbed there into the background, I really like. And I quite like the way the storage presentation has been made here, where it's giving you just enough information while still keeping it remarkably clear and understandable. This is a minor one, and probably one that most users will experience once and never again, but I did want to touch on it, and that is that the mobile installation, remember earlier on when I mentioned you can set this device up over Bluetooth with the mobile app for iOS and Android? It reminds me of a computer game installation in that while it's doing the installation, it's actually giving you tips throughout that process. It's a minor thing, but it's something I'm surprised a lot of brands do not do. It's one thing to see a loading bar, but the fact that this is now telling me what I can and cannot do with the system, as well as making recommendations after initialization, I really like that. This next one caught me by surprise, given UniFi, Ubiquiti, and UI.com's general kind of history, I would argue, on a lot of their solutions pushing you towards web management. But if you access the system via UI.com and it notices that you've got local access as well, it will actually go out of its way to recommend that you switch to a local access point there. Again, I can understand if I was accessing the system via maybe one of two different connections and recommending a faster network interface, but the fact that I was accessing this system via UI.com via the site manager and it was still recommending local file transmission for enhanced performance, I really like that. This is a hot button topic in the world of NAS in the last few years, but compatibility. Now, many users, myself included, when we learned that the UniFi was going to have their own drives for this system, just like they do for their UNVR system, I had question marks about their approach on compatibility. And I'm pleased to say it's not a problem. Not only have they confirmed with me that third-party drive compatibility is a thing, but I was able to install 24 TB Seagate iWolf drives inside this system, and it didn't throw me any warning. It didn't throw me any incompatibility. It didn't stop me using the drive. It just went ahead and rolled in that drive into my existing pool, or even allowed me to use it as a hot spare straight away. There was no conflictions with third-party drive compatibility, despite them offering their own drives. Next up, you've got the native file and folder manager that you can access via the web browser, again on the local area network or remotely using your UI account. The file folder manager is very responsive in the web browser there. I was able to view photos, play video, play audio files. You can also very quickly clone files if you want to find out more information about the files, and you can go ahead and share files very easily with password protection, usage protection, as well as date and expiry that you can apply to any of those files and folders. And remember, you can access snapshots very easily on the right hand side too. I was able to create new folders, upload files lovely and quickly, and all of this very, very snappily and responsively, and this applied to, again, whether I was accessing remote or not. Alongside shared folders, general bog standard folders to upload data into, and go ahead with creating individual standalone drives, you can go ahead and create encrypted drives as well. These encrypted drives will either have a password cipher that you create yourself or a downloadable key that you're going to need to upload in the event of, say, a system reboot after a firmware update or after a given period of time where the drive can be inaccessible. This will allow you to make sure that the encrypted drive isn't accidentally left open, particularly as mentioned in the case of a system restart after a firmware update. On top of that, when it comes to updating the system, it's actually a lot more granular. Not only is there different versions of release channels, depending on your relationship, of course, with UniFi, but on top of that, you can choose whether you want all of the updates for the individual drive client and the NAS itself to happen at the same time, aggregated together, or individually at different times of day, or keep one of them cutting edge up to date and the other one on the most stable candidate. I'm sure as more apps and services are added to the UniFi's UNAS Pro platform, I think this is going to become even more useful over time when some users are going to want the system updates to be cutting edge, but individual client tools and apps to be a little bit more granular overall to, stop things like restarts or making sure you're using the most stable versions of those. Whereas in other cases, you might want to go for the release candidate or a new featured update. Next up, when it comes to creating individual users and the full user account control via the control plane on the UNAS Professional, I will say, 1, very user friendly, 2, you don't have to always bind them with a UI account. Whether it is that you want to use a standard average user that's only got read-only access, or you want to go full-blown and create a super user who's got full read-write and system access, you can do that. You can even limit whether they've got full drive access or full NAS OS access, one, both, or limited access to one or both. It's actually quite a nice tailored approach when you're modularizing the full NAS operating system and the drive application. Separating them actually makes a great deal of sense in this context. I'm just hoping to see more from UniFi on the UNAS system with individual applications and services, and therefore this modular level of access and ease user creation all rolled into play. An area where I think a lot of brands get it wrong, and I'll say that UniFi have done a damned fine job, is to do with snapshots. Now, snapshots are pretty common on NAS systems. They're the ability to roll back different versions of files or entire drives quite quickly. And I will say right now that the UniFi system here is not only incredibly straightforward, but I will also highlight with those snapshots that restoring them is incredibly straightforward as well, something a lot of brands get wrong. Notwithstanding that you can browse the version history quite easily to find out just exactly what the impact of different changes across multiple snapshots will be, right the way down to thumbnails being displayed, but you can also lock individual snapshots if you choose to ensure that some snaps are never deleted or overwritten, as you've got retention policies that can change over time. Now, once you do restore a snapshot from the past, you're even invited to create an additional restore snap in case something goes wrong. So say you go ahead and restore an old snapshot and it turns out that didn't really resolve the issue that you had to go back to an old version of a file, then you don't have to think that you've now put all your eggs in one basket because of that creation of a pre-restore snapshot. Time and time again, I'm talking about UniFi nailing down the fundamentals on this system first and foremost, and of course one of those is going to be backups. Now, we've already mentioned there isn't any USB ports on this system, so USB backups are completely off the table, but you can synchronize a backup with another UNAS system. Unfortunately, I don't have one here to show you, but you can also use remote CIFS backups, but of course you can use SMB backups to another NAS system, and this is incredibly straightforward. Only requires you to have the login credentials for that system, and then from there you can establish a connection between the two and then select individual, and we are talking multiple drives within the UNAS system, to a targeted destination on SMB NAS kind of architecture there to back up the content of those folders onto another NAS. It's not new, but I will highlight that it's just been done in a very user-friendly fashion here. And once you factor in that you've got that means of backup as well as cloud backups that we'll talk about in a moment, it's a nice, easy, and again very streamlined, responsive way to back up your files and folders on this system straight out the gate. The same goes for those of you that want to take advantage of an existing area of cloud space. UNAS to Google Cloud Backup is again very, very straightforward. It's fast, it's responsive, and although only Google Drive is supported at the moment, hopefully they expand upon that later, it's still great to have such a straightforward and easy backup operation from this UniFi NAS to an existing cloud space that I may be migrating away from. Finally, on the subject of backups, it's worth highlighting that the main dashboard of Drive does give you a nice handy little chart here to give you a quick one-glance status of all of your backups. Now, I've been using this system for quite a while, going through many different updates from Ubiquiti for this UniFi NAS, and things have changed over time. So I've actually been using it for a great deal longer than the list of backups here would indicate. But even straight away, on this brief number of backups here over the course of a week, we can see which ones were successful, which ones weren't, and we can go into the logs and find out why, and also when active backups are in place in blue there, meaning that when a backup is particularly large, you can still find out which ones are being actioned right now. Some of that being indicated, of course, with the throughput, file services and user information being displayed on those graphs. Overall, it's a very clear layout there for those individual backup tasks and a quick one glance understanding of what backups have worked, which ones haven't, and which ones are happening right now. Next up, another huge UniFi staple. I want to talk a little bit about the LCM or LCD screen on the front of the UNAS Pro, because right now that UNAS Pro LCD screen, I would argue, is more useful here than it ever was on the majority of UniFi products. It is incredibly user friendly. Again, that's a key word today, but on top of that, unlike a lot of NAS devices that have an LCD screen and limited control, this gives me everything: temperatures, CPU RAM utilization, ports, a lot of the system utilization by individual users, all of that displayed there on the screen on a touchscreen control, but it's done in a far more dynamic fashion. A lot of the time when I see LCD screens, it gives me information that is not dynamic or changing. The layout of the information on the LCM screen here is dynamic. It changes every second, probably less than a second in fact. And UniFi have expanded more into this by adding some on-site features that are controllable that genuinely annoys me I've not seen elsewhere. And probably the biggest one for me is fan control. Built into that LCM panel there, you can control the fans of the system. That doesn't sound like much, but take my word for it. For anyone that's ever worked in a server room, anyone that's worked adjacent to a rack mount server in particular, when the beeps start going off and you want to turn that beep off, and one of the beeps happens to be that it's dropped off the network, you try turning that beep off when you can't access the system on the network. The ability to control certain things, lowering or increasing fan controls via the LCM, is very, very beneficial and saves a great deal more time than having to log in, go via two-factor authentication or two-step, make your way into the GUI, go into the control panel just to lower the fans or increase the fans accordingly, and I like that it's here. Likewise on the LCM, I like that I've got real-time information on read and write activity inside the system. It's one thing to give me, as in the case of a lot of other NASs, a amber light that's flickering to let me know that there is quote-unquote activity. This is far more analytical, and it's giving me real-time information about read-write activity within the system, which is of course reflective of upload and download. Again, having that displayable on screen in real time and measurable to megabytes and gigabytes is hugely beneficial in terms of very fast monitoring and troubleshooting. Next up, actually creating those shared drives is painfully easy. You just go straight into the Drive tab and you can just create as many folders as you want at the top right. On top of that, you can manage the amount of storage quota this drive has across the rest of the whole system, assign which users have got levels of control, and that can be extended down to groups as well, and of course those snapshot settings we talked about earlier on. You can go ahead and either create snapshots on the fly at any time and create the configuration and schedule of those snapshots directly in line Well, when you first set up the folder and get it all done lovely and snappily out the gate. I wanted to make sure that I showed you this one via the remote access via the UI.com account rather than using local, just to show you just how quick and responsive it was to create a new shared drive and configure that shared drive straight away out the gate, ready to dump files and folders onto the system immediately. Very easy, very straightforward, and it allows a business or a home user to create shared storage very quickly and responsively on the fly. I know I keep repeating those two words, but it's critical to understand that it is obvious that UniFi here are trying to prioritize the fundamentals of this system more than going snazzy and AAA apps. I just hope they add those later, but I've got to give them kudos for nailing the fundamentals so beautifully here. But unfortunately, all that positivity aside, we've got to now talk about the things about this system which left me, at best unimpressed and at worst pretty disappointed. Let's talk about some of the things in the Drive and UniFi U-NAS Pro that in a software level really are going to put it behind its competition at launch, and hopefully they can make improvements to this down the line to close the gap perhaps. I mentioned earlier on that when you set the system up for the first time, you don't need to create a UI.com account. You can do the whole thing offline. However, if you want to establish remote access, you are going to need a UI.com account. It has to go via their own server relays there. It is mandatory for remote access. You can't use Tailscale, you can't use anything like TeamViewer, you can't use third-party remote access methods. You have to use a UI.com account. Although I will add, when it comes to getting updates for the system, you don't necessarily need a UI.com account to get those downloaded. This next one surprised me a little bit for a company that's got such a long established history in terms of network switches, but the network controls and management on the system was actually pretty underwhelming. Notwithstanding that this system's only got a couple of ports there and the 10 GBE there is SFP and the other one's copper, but still, I couldn't adjust my MTU, the jumbo frames and stuff. There was just a usual, DHCP or static. The failover IP was a nice extra and nice to be able to configure that. But nonetheless, network controls on this are a little limited. And I will say there's definitely a vibe that this has been designed to coexist with an existing UniFi NAS switch or network controller in a way that other NAS systems are designed to go straight into the router. This is one that I really hope does change over time, and I'm going to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt as it's only just arrived in the market, but there's no means to install UniFi Protect. Now, they've got their own range of UNVRs, but they've also got machines like the UniFi Dream Machine that are multi-purpose, can be used for surveillance, can be used for network management, can be used, for management of individual devices and overall control. I think it's kind of a missed opportunity here that you can't install UniFi's surveillance platform Protect on this system here. This next one is another example of how this system, I believe, has been developed ideally to exist within an existing UniFi network, and that is I couldn't find any native multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, two-step authentication, OTP, or anything like that for offline network deployment. If I'd used a UI.com account, of course, you can enable two-step or use their own 6-digit authenticator, but for online deployment, I could still only use their own tools there. I couldn't use an existing two-step authenticator on this system. And that was a little bit limiting for me. If I was going to go for just a NAS on its own, I want to use my own proprietary two-step authenticating tool for all of my devices. I don't want to have to install another tool. This next one is a point that I think, or at least hope, will change very soon, but that was the lack of support of write once, read many, or worm on the folder creation there in the shared areas. I mentioned earlier on that there was a mutable options for these snapshots to ensure that you can't remove them or alter them too much and they become the kind of non-changeable point in history. Having the support of write once, read many on a folder level, particularly protected for things like ransomware there, I think is a kind of a missed goal here on the UniFi NAS, but I do think this is going to be one of those things they will eventually integrate. And again, I think this is going to be another thing that will change over time, and that was no means to actually individually select pools or individually select hard drives to be within individual pools from within the UniFi NAS setup. With some NAS systems, some users, in the case of a 4 or an 8 bay device, they might like to create 2 individual pools and then use 2 different kinds of media, perhaps say 4 drives that are hard drives in one RAID pool and 4 SSDs in another. I wasn't able to select individual drives or create a secondary pool. Again, this is something that might change in later updates, but at least now in the version that I'm reviewing, this was not present. This next one's a really minor complaint, I'm sure some of you think, but there was no option for scheduled on and off. I could turn the LCD screen on and off. I could even control the fans via that LCM, of course. But I didn't quite like the fact that I couldn't do a scheduled on and off. And I know there are some users that might do that for power saving reasons, but there are just other users that do not like their server being on when they go to sleep, and they just like to have a scheduled on and off to have the system on only when they need to access it. And that option just wasn't available here, even though this has been a universal option across the world of NAS for a very long time. Next up, there was no means to take advantage of the metadata that may have been accessible via the data stored on the system. A lot of NAS brands will scrape that metadata, everything from photography data that gives you a great deal more information about the background of the file to video information that, may have compression techniques, file formats, codecs, and the like. The result is that metadata can actually be used for intelligent filtering when going through files there, as well as allow you to find out more information about data than just what's on screen. And I was just kind of disappointed that when I went into the File Explorer, went into the preview, there wasn't really an information tab that was garnering this information. The preview tab showed me files, played videos, showed me even played the music, but it didn't allow me to access that metadata, which I would argue a lot of very domestic class NAS systems allow me to do. And this next one, again, tippy toes a little bit more into the higher end prosumer enthusiast, but there was no support of Docker and no support of containerized applications at all. And the result was that if I wanted to get this system and, run little sandboxy type app environments or, more populist apps like Plex Media Server, it's just not available here. This is clearly a system that is prioritizing and focusing on storage a lot. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the lack of container or Docker support does limit a lot of more advanced and enthusiast users really expanding upon what the hardware resources of the system can do.
Also, something that came up during the editing of this video is that UniFi are updating their identity application to allow for one-click mounting of your shared drives to your operating system, which will definitely simplify things a great deal. Wish I could have got my hands on it, but unfortunately it is something that's going to be released after this video is being published. If this is as good as they say it's going to be, it will simplify the mounting process for numerous operating systems to bolt on your UNAS Pro 2 simplified file folder storage on your native File Explorer. In conclusion, and I will be making a deeper video on this software very soon, just dedicated directly to it, I've got to give them credit for nailing down all those fundamentals. You're going to hear me reiterating this point in the conclusion of this video, but at least in terms of the software, I got to say that if they nailed down the fundamentals very, very well, but I'm not going to call this an exciting software experience. A lot of users only want to use their NAS for just storage, and I get it, and I think for you guys, in just plain storage terms, this is a great NAS, but for those of you that have gotten used to the app-heavy, flashy, slick, colourful user interfaces of other NAS brands, this is going to come across as very two-dimensional for you. I do think there are going to be new features added. I do think some of those features like write once, read many, perhaps even Docker integration and containerization of applications may come down the road, but they're definitely not there now, and I think users need to be aware of that. But ultimately, it is a smooth, slick, responsive experience. There's those words again, but I'm not going to call it an exciting experience. I think it's fair to say that this device is not going to please everybody. Existing UniFi ecosystem users are probably going to be able to get behind it so quickly due to that GUI and the user experience being so UniFi from the beginning to end. But if you are someone that has been utilizing Synology, QNAP, UNAS, UNRAID, or any of them over the last few decades, then chances are this user interface is not going to be what you would consider user-friendly. It is user-friendly, I will say, within the UniFi ecosystem, but the lack of some features that are available on AAA platforms right now in NAS are absent here, and you really need to keep that in mind if you are someone that already has an existing network attached storage device, a modern one at least, in your UniFi ecosystem and are thinking of ejecting that in favour of this. Now, that sounds like I'm being really negative, and I really don't want that to be the case. I'll say right now, this thing effing nails down the fundamentals really well. All of the staples, all of the network storage that I would expect as the fundamentals on a device like this are nailed down beautifully. Responsively, they are presented in a user-friendly fashion and ultimately are done as good as I would want them to be within a UniFi ecosystem. The first time setup, crazy straightforward and fast. The lack of need of using a UI.com account or any kind of online services, offline only, is incredibly pleasing. The way this system handles snapshots, the way this system handles snapshot folders, locking, password encryption on folders are all great to me. The way first time storage setup, A1. The kind of reactive storage variables there, with introducing new drives there, the changing the protection there of redundancy on the fly, very, very good. All great stuff there. The 10G out the box is an expectation. I'm glad they delivered on it. I would have liked to see more ports. The LCD panel, I didn't go into any. I could make a whole video about just that panel and how much I loved and how good it is compared to any other NAS brand I've ever used in terms of its responsiveness and the level of control afforded to me on it. Everything down to spinning down the fans and performing drive testing there. The system feels stable as hell in terms of reactive storage and knowing that the data on it is safe there. The single panel dash GUI, the drive system there, the backup options, NAS to NAS, NAS to cloud, whatever, although I'm sure they're going to evolve even more over time, are still there at the moment and do exactly what they say they're going to do. It's a seamless integration into an existing UniFi network, but that's the point in an existing UniFi network. The fact that I can't add UniFi's surveillance platform Protect onto this kind of bums me out. I understand why they probably wouldn't do it, because it would undermine the UniFi Dream Machine or UNVR systems a tad, but still, this is the same hardware as the UNVR. Allow me to install Protect, the single 10G there, rather than two 10G for me to leverage as a failover rather than the 1G. Kind of bums me out. The 7 SATA ports I find weird. The first 7-bay NAS I've ever seen. The hardware value of an ARM-based CPU and 4GB DDR4 memory is not going to please anyone, even if this system does a great job with that amount of efficient hardware to start with. Again, I rarely ever maxed it to 100% there. I don't think I ever actually did. I think I got into the 90s at most. The network controls feel weirdly limited compared to, UniFi switches, which I found really odd. Although I could schedule the LEDs to turn off, I couldn't schedule the system to power up or power down, and moreover, the lack of redundant power supplier kind of got on my nerves a little bit. Ultimately, as I've said several times in this video, this system is pure UniFi. Love it or hate it. This system, if you're an existing UniFi user and you love the way UniFi does things and you like UniFi products and the way they are presented in a user-friendly, responsive, but arguably very handholdy fashion, you're going to love this. But if you've already been utilizing a Synology, a QNAP, or whatever system for the last 2 decades that those brands have been around, this thing is going to feel limiting. Now remember, it doesn't have to be an either or. If you've got a UniFi network and you were thinking of introducing a NAS network backup, this really fits that mold, because this will work very, very well with an existing third-party NAS system, allowing you, if you've already got a Synology or QNAP and you think you should have had an off-site or at least network backup, this serves as a great option within your UniFi ecosystem. But again, this thing, cut it down the middle and you're just going to find the word UniFi written through it. It's the most UniFi NAS you ever could have expected. When they said they were going to rock out a UniFi NAS, they weren't kidding. Needless to say, we're going to be comparing the UniFi U-NAS Pro against other NAS systems of a similar scale, similar price, and similar hardware. There's going to be those of you out there that are going to think that's pretty unfair, given that this is UniFi's first NAS, and we're comparing it against NAS brands who have had 20 to 25 years in the biz. Unfortunately, as a buyer, that is a comparison you are going to make, whether Ubiquiti and UniFi want you to or not. Do I like this system? Yes. Does it nail down the fundamentals? Yes. But is it an exciting system? No. And is it a suitable alternative to an existing Synology right now, or a Synology or QNAP device right now? No, I don't think it is. I think it is trying to do its own thing, and it's trying to be its own thing, and more, more speed to you. But just keep that in mind, guys. This is not a Synology or a QNAP, and that's the big takeaway. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to do a dedicated software deep dive on this very, very soon. We might even expand on the software section from this video and make it even longer to cover everything, so you know everything before you make any kind of purchase. Thank you so much for watching. There's a written review. It's hugely long. It took me ages. Linked in the description below. And if you have found this video helpful, and if you are thinking of getting hold of this device, please use the links in the description to take you to UI.com, because using those will help this channel. We get a little fee from any purchase that goes through them, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. But just make sure you found the video helpful and you were going to buy the device anyway. If they aren't true, don't use those links. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.